Hello and welcome to this webinar on getting the best tones and colour in digital photography. My name is Mark Wood. I'm a professional photographer and this webinar has been brought to you by BenQ and X-Rite, so a big thanks to them. Let's take a look at some stuff. I am a professional photographer and educator, and I work across quite a range of different photography disciplines. Now, this webinar is not about my work. What I want to be able to do here is share with you some thoughts on how to get the best tone and color from your digital photographs. So, one of the challenging situations I face as a photographer, it'll be low light conditions. So later in the webinar, I'm going to come back to this less than ideal scenario where I'm having to photograph in the dark. But I'm going to start with the ideal world. Sometimes I'm shooting product photography, working in studios, and at the beginning of my color management pipeline is a color checker. It's really essential, and there's a couple of ways we can use this. So let me just swap over to Bridge, I think. No, I've put it into Lightroom. There we go. There we go. Here we I was doing a test shoot with Kelly some years ago, and this is an ideal situation to explain two uses of a color checker chart. In standard usage, just using the gray part of the white balance checker is important. So what you can do here in something like Lightroom is come along, grab the pipette, click over on the gray area of the white balance checker, click, and you get a balanced, you balance your whites and color. And that's sufficient for most photography in portrait scenarios, but sometimes you need to be more exacting. And for that, you flip the color checker chart open and use the color checker here and the passport software that ships with the color checker, and then you can make a more precise mapping of the color from the light source, the studio environment. And this would be important, say, if we were trying to make sure that Kelly's lipstick here was mapped from the studio right the way through to print. Another important part of capture is the quality of light. I recently delivered a product photography workshop for small businesses, creative businesses that might make necklaces, Christmas cards, or whatever. And I was trying to point out the challenges of trying to photograph with less than perfect light. So I was just using some standard studio light, office lights here, and they give off a very warm light, and that's not ideal. So no matter how much you try, I'll just do this in a crude way, it's very difficult to white balance a photograph that's been photographed in less than perfect light. Let's come back to some slides for a moment. Next up in the list from the shooting scenario is the importance of having a really good monitor, and also having a monitor with lots of resolution. Not only does it mean that you can show all the panels and palettes of Photoshop or Lightroom, it means that you can actually see your prints, your images on screen at the size they would be printed. What you've got on screen here is a web browser window opened previously in an ultra high definition monitor. That would be something like this sort of standard resolution of the SW270. What you're seeing on screen is a photograph of a 4K monitor, which means you're going to get a lot more pixels on screen. In fact, 4K, and that's what we're looking at here with the SW320 and 271 from BenQ, is 4K being 4 times high definition resolution. Another quality of a monitor, and it's important as you process the tones and colors of your photograph, is the bit depth of the monitor itself. Now, the BenQ monitors have excellent bit depth, great panels, which means that when you are processing photographs, you can see the tone in the photographs quite accurately. And the other feature that's very important is its ability to cover 99% of Adobe RGB. What I've done on screen here is called up a chromacity arch, all the colors the standard human eye can see. The black shape represents standard CMYK, the standard print colors, and the red dotted line represents sRGB. Now, I want to say something about sRGB. It's actually a very good workspace and is one very similar to the one used in video, and all sort of online publishing would sort of fit roughly into an sRGB space. But if your aim is to work in high quality print and also in magazine reproduction, you would be able to extend the color range from that limited sRGB space to the white triangle of Adobe RGB. And that's supported on the BenQ monitors. The red triangle, however, is ProPhoto, the synthetic working space of Lightroom. It's so big that it actually encompasses colors the human eye can't see, but it would extend a little bit into the infrared and ultraviolet. So it's a useful synthetic space to work in, but you can't even see all the colors that are in it. The BenQ 320 and the BenQ 271 are technical as certified. So if you're interested in video and working on industry standard colors, those monitors support the color accuracy found in Hollywood and used across the media and entertainment industries. And I think benchmarking is very important. As photographers and maybe even videographers, we might have a system that works well for us, but we need to make sure that what we're seeing on our screens is what other people see on their screens or in print. Okay. Let's just skip back and now have a look around some photographs and do some real processing. Let's just take a look at what might work well. I know what I'm going to do. I think it's going to be Lightroom. Just excuse me while I find my resources here, which is going to be, where have I put them? I moved them just. It's not that set. My eyes are failing. Oh, there it is. You see, it was under L all the time. What I'd like to do here is perhaps just call upon this photograph and take you through some straightforward enhancement. Now, I know not everyone uses Lightroom. It's a great piece of software. But what I want to do is cover some of the principles needed in photography. So I'm going to use Photoshop. So I'm just going to take this photograph here and I'm right-clicking on it, just a sort of top tip for anyone using Adobe software. Right-click on things and you'll get a context menu, and that'll tell you what you can do with that element. So I'm going to go to Export. No, I'm not. I'm going to go Edit in, Open a Smart Object in Photoshop. I'm going to slow down a little bit. Kind of the excitement and exuberance of getting through this webinar has set me off at a high pace here. Let's just take a slow look. Open as a smart object in Photoshop or edit in Photoshop. These are two choices you might have, and I'm going to choose this one. What's going to happen momentarily is the photograph will be processed and opened through into Photoshop. This isn't quite a lesson in Photoshop, it's not quite a lesson in Lightroom either, but it's covering some of the principles about the tone and color management within these sort of software. By opening a photograph as a smart object, round-tripping it from Lightroom in this way, I can, within Photoshop, double-click inside the Layers panel on the thumbnail, and I open up the photograph back in Adobe Camera Raw, which is the same RAW engine you find in Lightroom. So at any point in my workflow, I can get back to the raw state of my photograph and enhance the white balance. I could, if there's a gray card here, white balance card, I could click on that to balance out the colors. I can click OK. And we're back inside Photoshop again. First steps would be about adjusting levels or curves. I'm going to show levels first because it's quite destructive but helpful in this photograph. I'm just going to drag this out so you can see it clearly on screen. This is a histogram. If you don't understand and can't read histograms, it's an absolute must. This spike here in the histogram represents the white of the photograph, and these tones here represent the dark greys of, this is Catherine's dress. By dragging in the white slider, I'm making more of the photograph white. On a properly calibrated, reliable monitor like a BenQ, I can see this happening on screen. I can see the tones changing. But sometimes I'm working on a laptop, working in the field, trying to see what I'm doing, or sometimes just working at speed. So the top tip is to hold down the Alt key or Option key on your keyboard. So by holding down the Option key and clicking on the slider here, I get an overlay. I can drag over, and I'm forcing the background to white. But what that has done, and I'm just going to zoom in a little bit, is it's bleached out the tones in Catherine's forehead. And I want to restore that tone in a moment. Without having a really good monitor, I might not notice that. So I'm just dragging this back. You can see it's a properly exposed photograph. I wanted the background to be grey rather than white. You can see the bleaching effect. So I'm going to drag this over to clean up the background and then use the layer mask. In a paintbrush, and just think I'll stick that brush just very crudely here. Quickly paint over Catherine, and she looks a bit grey now because I've just restored the tone to her face. It's got the mask here; it's black. So what I'd rather do now is come and use curves. Curves are great when you can control them well. In Lightroom, it's easier to do than Photoshop because Photoshop will allow you to do all kinds of strange things. But I'm just going to click on this part of the curves here and lighten Catherine's face. I could also darken the tones, creating a little bit of an S curve here. You can see the S. It's very subtle. And I'm done. Now, next up, I'd probably want to look at adjusting the hue, the tones, and the saturation in the photograph. To do that, I'm going to go down here and use hue and saturation. And at this point in a workflow, I'll have covered all the basics in terms of image enhancement. Levels, perhaps. I might jump straight into curves rather than using levels, but I've used levels to clean up that background quickly. And then hue and saturation. It allows me to target areas of the photograph and change, in this case, the hue, the color of the color, so I can change the color of the beret if I want to. Adjust the saturation and the lightness. Now, you don't have to be super eagle-eyed to notice that Catherine's gone a little bit green. One of the great things about Photoshop and adjustment layers is that I can paint on the adjustment layer. This is quite a big concept flying through here, but you can play through this video a few times if you like, and I can stop the adjustment layer working and restore the tone and color. I don't need to worry about the top or the dress and the tights here because Catherine, she's wearing grey. And that's a really big brush. Something else, a nice feature of processing is to use a big brush to make sure that you don't get tight edges. If I'd used a small brush, it's less convincing. And that little bit of green showing in the shadow area of Catherine's head is more realistic. So I'll just bring it back a little bit more. Painting the tone there. And with that in place, now I can adjust the color of the beret again. And at this point in my workflow, I'm relying absolutely on the monitor to be showing me the colors as accurately as possible. And that's done by buying the right piece of kit in the first place. I'm using a BenQ SW320 for this presentation, though I've knocked the resolution down just to HD for this webinar. What I'm going to do now is just show you a few slides on how you can calibrate a monitor, how simple it is. So let me just pop back to my slides. So the BenQ monitors ship with the Palette Master Element software, or the Palette Master software, depending on the monitor that you're buying. And this is used for the hardware calibration of a monitor. Hardware calibration is tuning up the monitor properly. I like to play guitar. I don't know if I play guitar well, but one thing I make sure of before I start to play is that I tune it up to concert pitch, if you get the analogy. I'm going to use the Palette Master Element software to tune up my monitor to the equivalent of concert pitch for color, to make sure that the tones and color on my monitor are displayed accurately. And rather than go through the process fully, because it'll take most of the webinar time to do this, I'll just show you a few slides from the software. You plug in a calibrator. I'm using an X-Rite i1 Pro. You can see the Display Pro here. It's connected. It's telling me the monitor I'm using. This is when I was doing a profiling and a demo for the SW721. And I've chosen the advanced mode. It's not particularly difficult. It just gives you a few more options. What I can do here is I can choose to be a photographer as a default. There's photographer, web designer, designer up here. Then choose a white point for the monitor. I choose D65, which is equivalent to daylight, 6500 Kelvin. It's not quite the same, but it's a specific value. And then I choose my primaries. Because I like to work in print, I choose Adobe Srgb. And then for luminance, how much light should my monitor kick out? If you think back to the photograph of Catherine, you may or may not have seen the background around Catherine as displaying as white. You might have seen it as grey, dark grey, light grey. How grey was that white? If you set the luminance of your display high to something like 160 here, you'd have to sit in a studio with quite a lot of bright ambient light to see the monitor as being dull. Let me take that a little bit further. When you go to the movies, the cinema, to watch a film, they turn the lights down and that makes the screen look brighter and more vibrant. But the screen is still showing the same amount of light. In color management, and in standard low light conditions, I choose 120 as the value here, and then a gamma of 2.2. I'll move on to the next slide. And then I choose a profile type, a 16-bit lookup table with a large patch size. These are the patches over here on the right. I've configured the software properly, and I'm now ready for the monitor to be tuned up, so that when it's white is white, black is black, 50% grey is 50% grey, 75% grey is 75% grey. I'm going to see that accurately in the studio conditions I work in. But you can learn more in my BenQ post, Calibrating Color Critical Displays. Now let's get back to some processing and how this might work. I want to make a point that sometimes in color management, you're not interested in the accurate rendition of colors from the scene. A few years ago, I took my family on a road trip. We flew into San Francisco, went to see some step friends up in Yosemite, drove to Monterey, and then out to Sequoia, and then I drove to the Grand Canyon. My kids were 3 and 5 at the time. It was great. But anyway, along the way, we stopped off at a silver mine. and I've taken this photograph and just color stylized it to make it more cinematic, if you will. So let me show you how that one might work. I'm going to click on here, and again, edit in as a smart object in Photoshop, just because it means that I can access the raw information at any time. Let me come in here. There's no need to go to levels. I'll come in and make a curves adjustment. Oops, just quite happy with that. Now, some of the listeners, the viewers to this webinar, might have worked in darkrooms and dodged and burned photographs under a photographic enlarger. I'm old enough to have done that sort of thing. And the way I use adjustment layers and the mask here is similar to dodging and burning under an old photographic enlarger. This part of the wagon is too dark for my liking, so I'm going to put black in the foreground here, and with a brush at maybe 20% opacity, I'm just going to paint over these areas. You can see that on the mask it's going grey. This is effectively dodging this part of the photograph. I know that Photoshop has dodge and burn tools, but this is my preferred method. See, so I'm darkening down parts of the photograph, just switching off the adjustment there, but not making these shadow areas too dark. My other go-to adjustment was hue and saturation. I'll use that again. I can click on the little button here, little finger, I get a pipette, an eyedropper, I can drop onto this red, which is a little bit sort of cherryish, change the hue of the red. Let's get sort of towards purples now, or over to make it a little bit more sort of orangey red, and I can boost the saturation. It's also affecting the yellows because the adjustment here, if we just look at this area of the image, it's targeting the reds but bleaching out or leaching out into the yellows. So I can try and bring that across to restrict the adjustment more to the red area. And with the same adjustment, I need to go in and think about the sky. So I'm going to target the sky, and it's currently blue, and I can shift that over into quite a teal color, increase the saturation of that, or desaturate the color, lightness and darkness here, until I've stylized the color. And just switching the eye on and off on the properties panel here, you can see the color changes. But all of this is nothing if I've spent a lot of time working on a photograph with the monitor not set up properly. Once it's tuned up, the colors I'm seeing on screen are those that could be then reproduced on another device. Okay, that device might not be set up properly, but that's their problem, not mine. Or I might want to go out to print. I'll cover some little thoughts on printmaking in a while. So let's see what else we can find. Just, okay, yeah, this photograph comes to mind only because it's got muck and dirt on it. I'm afraid that in swapping lenses at this air show, I managed to get dust into my camera, and there's no way I was going to be cleaning it on the day. In fact, I didn't really notice. I could remove the dust within Lightroom. I can just come up here to the spot removal, and I can visualize spots. It's a useful tool because sometimes the greasy marks on a sensor are hard to see, so I could visualize the spots in Lightroom, and I can then remove them here. I've not removed them all for a reason. I'm just going to take this photograph and edit in Photoshop. Here we go. So Lightroom does a very good job of spot removal, but sometimes you're going to want to do the spot removal inside Photoshop because it might be in a tricky area, maybe over some texture and detail, and it requires some hand processing. If you do that and you use the smart object workflow that I'm using, and let's just use the spot healing tool here. I'm getting a no symbol, no entry. You cannot work on this image because, well, actually because it's a smart object. There's a very simple way to work around that, and that's inside Photoshop's layers panel to click on the new layer icon, get a new blank layer, and now the spot healing brush will work. And that's because, if I just move over here, I'm sampling all layers. If that's unchecked, it won't sample the layer beneath. It's just a way of getting around the smart layer issue. So now I can come in here and quickly remove those blemishes. For more tricky areas, I might try to use the spot healing, the clone stamp tool. With that in place, again, just repetition here. Hopefully I'm not slowing down too much. I've steadied the pace somewhat in the webinar now. I'm just going to change the color of the sky. Just a little. What I do when I'm doing this is I'm actually trying to recall the sort of prints, the posters of the 1950s and 60s. I know this aircraft, this is a 1930s aircraft, but just sort of mimicking some of the colors you might see in posters or cinema from that time. I'm going to save that photograph. In fact, I'm going to save all the photographs I've been working on because I need to show you something inside Lightroom. Once we get back into Lightroom, the photographs are coming back in. So the wagon, the aircraft, and Catherine. Let's just go back to the aircraft image. If I want to edit this again inside Photoshop from within Lightroom, I would choose Edit in Photoshop, because when I do that, I get a different dialog box and I can edit the original file. So I'll click Edit. Up it comes with all the layers in place. I'll go back to Lightroom and I can toggle it this way. Remember, Catherine had lots of layers, so if I could choose Edit in Photoshop, but edit a copy, this will open up into Photoshop, and I can work on the layers again. And the other alternative would be, might as well use this one. What I'm going to do inside Lightroom, inside Develop here, so I'm just going to come down to Vignette. There we are. Working at lower resolution means that my computer looks unfamiliar to me, so I'm just going to go to Vignette, the image. I'm doing that quite in a strong way. Let's feather that through a little bit. You know, we spend all that money on really great lenses that don't vignette, and then I, for one, spend a lot of time adding it in post-processing. So this time, I can go Edit in Photoshop, because I've already edited it as a Photoshop image. But if I choose Edit as a copy with Lightroom adjustments, Here we go. I no longer have a layered file. So just come back to Lightroom. When you've first time round from Lightroom, I would choose Edit as a smart object in Photoshop. Second time round, because I'm going to round trip again, but the same image, I would choose to Edit in Photoshop. But I might choose to edit the original or edit a copy. If I choose to edit a copy with Lightroom adjustments, any layers that were in the Photoshop file will be compressed. Okay, I'm trying to think what would be useful to explain the next points. Let's just come back to bridge, I think. Right. Some low, I showed this photograph earlier. This is a blues man, sadly no longer with us, but excellent blues band. And I'm going to open in Camera Raw. And what I'm going to do is show you the option you get within Adobe Camera Raw, the color management stuff today, really. There's a little hyperlink at the bottom of Adobe Camera Raw when you open up a RAW file into Photoshop via Bridge or directly from within Photoshop. What you have are some options here to open it as ProPhoto, Srgb, or Adobe RGB. The others are not particularly relevant anymore. So Srgb would be appropriate if your workflow is only going to be video, or you might be a wedding photographer or a kind of photographer that uses photo labs. Their machines reproduce photographs in a kind of Srgb color space equivalent, so there's no reason to go to Adobe RGB. I choose ProPhoto. I also choose to have the photograph process in 16 bits per channel, not 8. Our digital cameras record in RAW in 12 or 14 bits per channel. Even my going back 15 years or so, my digital camera was processing in 10 bits per channel back then. So there's no reason to want to open the photograph in Photoshop in 8 bits per channel, because at this point you're throwing away data that you might want to use. And also here, this is where I can check the box, open in Photoshop as a smart object. So I click OK. All I'm going to do is open this object into Photoshop. And here we go. The challenge, though, is that I'm working in ProPhoto. I might be working on a monitor that's showing Adobe RGB, so I can't see the ProPhoto space, but I've got the tones there, and I'm seeing it through the filter of Adobe RGB. So I could be processing the tones and colors of this photograph. However, if I was then to output it to a tablet or a lesser monitor or to a TV, or to go to a photo lab printing, the image would perhaps be something different. So I'm going to go and change this to Srgb from ProPhoto. It would be better, you see, you get a huge color change. So I'm going to go to Convert to Profile, Preview. You can see that I'm working in ProPhoto with all the goodness of and color values of ProPhoto. But I'm only going to see it on my monitor in Adobe RGB. So come to Adobe RGB. Surprisingly, no change because that's the color space. But if I come to Srgb, the colors are diminished. So for some people, it might be best to work with an Srgb workflow because that's ultimately their destination, because they might have processed photographs got some fantastic high dynamic range, fully saturated photographs, but when it comes to output, you're going to be limited to sRGB. I'm going to cancel that because there's another thing to look at as well in terms of color management, and that is soft proofing. I'm doing this inside Photoshop, but you can do it inside Lightroom. I can go to View and Proof Setups, and I could choose to take a look at this on some bamboo paper. What am I doing here? When you've hardware calibrated a monitor and processing on screen in its generic form, you're seeing the tones represented really well, but not specifically for any particular outcome. So by using soft proofing, and this is made so reliable by using a BenQ monitor, I can customize the proofing conditions. So I can simulate different types of paper. In this case, I could choose some satin paper. Can you see how this is changing on screen? Or pearl paper. And somewhere in here, I've got some super gloss. Now, gloss paper tends to give the closest representation of tone and color as you see on screen because it's coated, it's glossy, and when you change that to something like a rag paper, such as bamboo, you don't get the same richness of color. It's a lovely thing to see though, so I can simulate the black ink of a print and simulate the paper color. So soft proofing comes into its own when you have a hardware calibratable monitor. Let me just choose a different image to demonstrate some of these things. Probably do it from Lightroom. I think I'll choose this one. So this time I should be able to go and soft proof, show proof. This is a proof condition, and somewhere up the top, where has it gone? I can go in and affect proofing. For that shot. Oh, there it is. Sorry, just because my monitor is only smaller in this thing, I can go in here and look at the photograph, and I can simulate paper and ink. So I can just choose a profile, simulate the paper. I can change different values. So what I'm seeing on screen is a representation of the tone and color that I'll get if I was to put it out onto this Marita paper. Let me just come back into some problematic stuff here. Way back when, at the beginning of the webinar, I was talking about less than ideal conditions, sort of photographing in the dark. If I come through here, I can choose my webinar stuff, which was, what did I call it? There we go. Noise reduction. Now this is a band called Mouses. It's my son's favourite band, and I asked the guys if did they mind me photographing at the weekend. They're very loud, kind of punkish, but nice guys. So I sort of went along and shot these last Saturday. And as you're seeing these photographs on screen, everything looks fine. But if I come back to this one, I was taking a look at this one earlier. There you go. These are shot at high ISO. If I come through here, and zoom in. Just come in a bit closer. There we go. You can see there's a lot of digital noise going on because I'm shooting at quite high, well, a very high ISO, because it was quite a dark space. Switch that off. By having a high resolution monitor, 4K, and I'm not showing in 4K at the moment, I can zoom in to see the whole image on my monitor in one go and come through and start looking at cleaning up the image. Being quite brief about this, the way to do it is to take noise reduction, bring up the luminance, and this starts to remove the kind of grittiness and the artifacts you might find in the photograph. You can compare bringing up the luminance removal, that's the blurring of that graininess, with the preservation of detail. So areas of detail are then left sharper, and you can increase contrast to make sure the image doesn't soften up, because the more you bring up luminance smoothing, the softer the image becomes. See, softer, try and preserve the details, but by adding in contrast, you try to balance out the image. Now there's no magic ingredient for this, but by being able to see your print at a relative size, so on a 4K monitor I could have the print size showing, I could see the noise, remove it and scale it properly. So I'm going to bring that back. First step would be to remove the luminance, and then to take a look to see if there's any color artifacts in the image. But by having to zoom in like this, I can't see the totality of the image. I can't see it all on screen. So a big sort of shout out for having a 4K monitor. So with this image, just going to come back to camera raw, just to show you that it's the same kind of thing. So if I came over to lens correction, I can remove chromatic problems within camera raw. Don't know if it's going to find the camera model here. And also the same parameters happen in Adobe Camera Raw for reducing luminance noise. But one sort of final point before I bring things to a conclusion about low light photography or enhancing darkened photographs is how light is this background? How dark is it? How light? If I'm not mapping my tones properly on a monitor, I can't see the image properly. So let me just use curves to demonstrate this. You need the photograph to be adjusted correctly. So at this, I think that's lacks subtlety. I'll just switch the eye on and off here so you can see the before and after. What I'm trying to do with processing is darken down areas of the image. Just going to reset that. I'm just trying to bring that in. There we go. Always helpful to have the eye switched on when you're trying to preview. Just rookie mistake there. I'd switched that off for a moment and then didn't switch it back on and couldn't work out why, even though I'm making massive adjustments to the image. I couldn't see any change, and that's because the eye here wasn't checked. There we go. So I can darken down the background. Hopefully you can see that on your displays as it's been transmitted, and then subtly lift the tones of the photograph. I mean, look at that, it's quite subtle. But I could spend minutes, several minutes, maybe an hour correcting a photograph for a fine art exhibition, I want to know what I'm seeing on my screen is an accurate representation of the print I'm going to be getting. But with this one, I've got the background back to black, but then that just final bit, I'm going to get the paintbrush. The opacity is 20%, that's fine, just make it a bit bigger. And I can just come in here and perhaps put a little bit of extra information in these shadow areas of the photograph. Checking all the time to make sure that I'm not losing tone. So if I come in here closer, if I push this around, what I'm taking care not to do is not to break down the image by overplaying the adjustment. So subtle adjustments of curves are a key part of my photoshopping, image enhancement, but I need to make sure that I'm doing that on a monitor I can rely on. So moving back towards the beginning again, and that's going to be under L, Lightroom and Photoshop. Bring up this image here, edit in Photoshop. I'll just edit the original, losing track of where I am. So adjustments. At the point of capture, I will either use a white balanced card, so a color checker passport is always with me. In fact, I'll go back to those slides. I think that's going to be helpful. So I always have the color checker with me. I might just use the grey panel only in order to balance out the scene, or for more exacting shoots, actually build a profile for the studio I'm working in. I then consider the tone of the photograph, and I might use levels, more typically using curves and using hue and saturation. I've done this with inside Photoshop, but I could do this inside Lightroom. So if I just come back, there we go. In fact, I'll do it on this image here. So inside Lightroom, just open up the histogram. I can come in and make the same sort of adjustments on a histogram directly inside Lightroom before going on to adjust the color. And the sort of go-to adjustment for me is hue and saturation, something that you also find with inside Lightroom. There we go, hue, saturation, and lightness. And then from there, swapping here and there, I would use soft proofing to see how the image looks in a particular condition. So that's soft proofing on and off. It's quite subtle on that photograph. Let me see if I can find view soft proofing. Let me find this view soft proofing bamboo. View proof setup custom, just make sure this is, there we go. I can see how the photograph will look, simulating paper color there, bamboo looking like bamboo. And then I might then further adjust the photograph. I might choose to adjust these settings or bring in another curve over the top. You can see the histogram here is breaking down, showing the adjustments I've already made, but I might adjust again so I'm seeing the photograph through the filter of the bamboo paper that I might print it on. Well, that sort of brings me to the end of things. Hopefully you've found it useful. When it comes to calibrating, I have a little reminder that you can find more on my BenQ post, Calibrating Color Critical Displays. But that's not all. There is an offer on between the 19th and 20th of December. There's 15% off the SW720, 7000, the 3200, and the 271. The difference being the 2700 is an ultra high definition monitor. It's an award-winning monitor and will be supported on computers that don't have a really big graphics card. I love all the three of these. The 320 and the 271 are excellent monitors, but they're both 4K, which means you've got to have a really good video card. So do check that before making use of the 15% offer. You can do that by going to benqdirect.com. The URL is at the bottom of the screen. And I've also included my URL. This isn't shameless advertising for me. If you've got any questions, if you go to markwoodphotography.com and the contact page, there's a contact form. Feel free to ask questions and I'll try and get back to you as soon as possible. So that's me thanking BenQ and Xrite for hosting this webinar.